I will tell you about the year I came back. Not back to London, though that came later. Not back to society, or to the obligations that wait for a man with a title and an estate and the collected expectations of 3 counties. I mean back to myself, to the part of myself I had sealed off with the same efficiency a man boards up a room he does not wish to enter, setting a chair against the door, telling himself he will attend to it later, knowing he will not. The accident happened in March of 1817. I was riding along the upper edge of the Ashvere pasture on a horse I knew better than to ride in that weather, a gray gelding named Ptolemy, 17 hands, more intelligence than temperament, and a pheasant burst from the bracken at the precise moment. A gust came across the ridge, and the gelding shied left and I went right, and the world became a sequence of very loud sensations ending in stillness and the smell of cold mud. My steward found me an hour later. I was conscious by then, propped against the stone wall at the field's edge, watching the light with the detached curiosity of a man who has recently been informed his relationship to light has changed. The physician came from Harwich. There was a second physician from York. There was a third from London, who said nothing the first 2 had not said, but said it with more authority and a larger bill. The verdict, delivered with the careful kindness men reserve for bad news. The right eye was intact. The left was damaged. The precise medical language I have since forgotten. What I retained was the phrase the third physician used almost in passing, as though it were a minor detail rather than a piece of my life handed back to me in altered form. Significant reduction in peripheral acuity, which translated in the weeks that followed to this, a narrowing, a dimming at the edges. The world did not go dark. That would have been simpler, a clean exchange. Instead, it became something I had to navigate carefully. A house with furniture I could not always place, light that behaved differently than it once had, depth at certain angles becoming unreliable. I was 31 years old. I had been considered, before March of that year, one of the more capable men in the northern counties. I did not say this with vanity. It was simply the working assessment of the people who depended on Ashvere and its management. I oversaw 12,000 acres, 4 farms, a timber concern, a mill. I sat on 2 committees and rode with the local magistrate on matters of some regularity. I had been to war, which had given me a useful habit of moving through difficult circumstances without requiring them to be pleasant. The accident did not break me. What followed the accident was what broke me, or came near to it. It was the way people looked at me afterward, or rather, the way they stopped looking at me directly, that small, almost imperceptible redirection of the gaze that occurs when a person is confronted with something they do not know how to accommodate. My neighbors who were kind, my tenants who were respectful, my cousin Gerald who meant every good thing he said and said too many of them. Letters from London friends with a register just slightly off, too careful, too gentle, pitched a tone lower than our usual exchange, as though I had become someone who required managing. I had not become someone who required managing. But I understood the arithmetic. They did not know what to do with a Duke of Ashvere who squinted at the wrong moments, who occasionally misjudged a doorframe, who had stopped riding to the hunt and stopped appearing in the dining rooms where his presence had previously been expected. And since they did not know what to do with me, most of them quietly stopped doing anything at all. The invitations thinned. The visits shortened. The drawing room at Ashvere, which had once been crowded in the evenings, became a room I sat in alone, watching the fire in my useful right eye while the left made its particular unreliable assessment of the shadows. I sent the staff a circular in September of that year. Ashvere would not be entertaining through the winter. I expected no visitors. Anyone seeking my business attention could write. I was not, I told myself, hiding. I was simply attending to things that required my attention. I had become very good at saying this. Cecily Vane arrived on a Thursday in early November. I know it was Thursday because Mrs. Alderton, my housekeeper, made a note of arrivals in a ledger she had kept since my mother's time, and when I later asked her to confirm the date, she produced the ledger without comment and pointed to the entry. November 7. Miss C. Vane, companion to the Dowager Countess. Mrs. Alderton had a gift for recording events without editorializing, which I had always found restful. My mother's aunt, the Dowager Countess of Westhaven, had been resident at Ashvere since the previous July. She was 81 years old, possessed of more opinions per square inch of conversation than anyone I had encountered before or since, and constitutionally incapable of admitting she required assistance. This last quality meant that when it became clear, to everyone except herself, that she required a companion, someone to read to her, to manage her correspondence, to be present in the room without being asked to justify their presence. The hiring of that companion had been accomplished through a system of elaborate indirection involving my cousin Gerald, my housekeeper, and a solicitor's letter of recommendation from a firm in Harwich, without the Countess ever admitting to having endorsed the arrangement. The companion came from Harwich. Her father had been a solicitor of some standing before his death 2 years prior. She was 24, well-lettered, and had written in her letter of application a sentence that Mrs. Alderton had read aloud to me with visible approval. I am not troubled by quiet. 3 additional candidates had written variations on their eagerness to be useful, their warmth, their skill at conversation. Only one had mentioned quiet. I did not meet her on the Thursday she arrived. I was in the library when the carriage came up the drive. I heard it, the gravel sound particular and familiar, and I did not look up from the estate papers I was reading, or rather navigating, at the large table that ran along the library's eastern wall, where the light came in best. Mrs. Alderton managed the arrival. That was her function, and she performed it with the same undramatic competence she applied to everything. I met Cecily Vane for the first time the following morning, in the corridor outside the Countess's rooms. She was carrying a stack of books and a shawl and a small covered dish that Mrs. Alderton had sent up, and she was managing all of it with the particular focused competence of someone accustomed to carrying more than was strictly convenient. I came around the corridors turning at the wrong moment. I misjudged the light at that hour, the left side of the passage always uncertain before 10, and we nearly collided. I stopped, she stopped. I expected the adjustment, the small recomposition of expression that people performed when confronted with me now, the careful neutralizing of whatever thought had just crossed their face. She looked at me with clear, steady attention, confirmed that we were not in fact going to collide, and said, "Good morning, Your Grace. I'm so sorry I didn't hear you." That was all. Then she continued down the corridor. I stood in the turning for a moment longer than was necessary. It was not that she had been rude. She had been perfectly courteous, the greeting correct, the apology brief and unforced. It was something else. Something in the quality of the look she had given me before she spoke, attentive and unguarded, the look of a person who is simply registering a fact, not managing it, not adjusting for it, just seeing it and then moving on. I could not remember the last time someone had looked at me that way. I went to my study and did not think about it again for the rest of the morning. The Countess improved markedly in the weeks after Miss Vane's arrival. I know this not because I spent time in the Countess's company. I had, since the accident, reduced my obligations in that direction to brief afternoon visits of 20 minutes, a limit the Countess regarded with vocal dissatisfaction. But because Mrs. Alderton told me, and because the atmosphere of the East Wing, which had been characterized for the previous 3 months by a low-grade tension traceable to the Countess's boredom and consequent willingness to reprimand anyone within earshot, had settled into something calmer. "She reads well," Mrs. Alderton told me, in the tone she used when something had met or exceeded expectation. "The Countess fell asleep during the 3rd chapter. That hasn't happened since September. Is that a success?" "It means she was comfortable enough to sleep. Yes, Your Grace, that's a success." I asked no further questions about Miss Vane. She was doing her work. The Countess was peaceful. The East Wing was quiet. This was the entirety of what I required. The library became the difficulty. Ashvere's library was the room I had lived in most completely since March. It was long and south-facing, with 3 good windows and shelves that went to the ceiling, and a fire that Mrs. Alderton had learned to keep at a precise temperature without being asked. The light in that room, between the hours of 2 and 5 in the afternoon, was the best light in the house, flat and even, useful to a man reading with one reliable eye, and one that behaved differently depending on the angle. I had understood the library to be my room. Not formally, it was the household library, available in principle to anyone in residence, but in practice it had become, in the quiet that followed the accident, the one space I could rely on. The staff did not enter unnecessarily. My cousin Gerald, on his last visit, had attempted to intrude and been so thoroughly met with silence that he had not tried again. The Countess's companion began using the library on the 4th evening of her residence. I was not there when she arrived. I had gone up for dinner at 7 and returned after 9, which was my usual pattern, and when I opened the library door she was already settled at the smaller table near the fire with 3 books open, and a candle at the precise angle of someone who had thought carefully about where to put it. She looked up when I entered. I looked at her. She returned her gaze to the books. "I'll leave," she said, without looking up again. "That isn't necessary. I didn't know you'd be returning. I can find another room." "The library is a shared room," I said, which was true in principle if not in recent practice, and I went to my usual chair at the eastern table and did not say anything further. We occupied the same room for an hour and a half in complete silence. She read. I worked. The fire did what fires do. When she left, just after 10:30, she closed the door with the careful quiet of someone who has been in the presence of concentration and has elected to respect it. I noted this. I did not analyze it. She came back the next evening. It was on the 3rd evening that she began to read aloud. Not to me. I want to be precise about this because the distinction matters. She was reading aloud to herself, or rather, she was doing what some readers do when a passage of sufficient weight arrives on the page, speaking it into the air, testing it, feeling the sentences work in the mouth. It was not a performance. She did not address me, did not look toward my table, did not pitch her voice as though she expected to be heard. She was reading history. I could not see the spine from my angle, but the cadence of the prose was that register particular to the better historical writers, long clauses, a stateliness that accommodated the weight of what it was describing. She read 3 sentences aloud, paused, and then continued to herself for some minutes, and then read another passage aloud. I set down my pen. I had not heard someone read aloud in this room since my mother. My mother had done it in the evening sometimes, to no one in particular, a poem, a paragraph she wanted to hold on to, a letter worth revisiting in sound as well as silence. I had not thought about this in years. I thought about it now. "Gibbon?" I asked. A pause. "Hume," she said, "The History of England." "Which reign?" "Henry." I considered this. The prose in the Tudor sections is better than the Stuart. Another pause, different in quality from the first. Consideration, not surprise. "I think the Stuart sections have a better argument," she said. "The prose suffers because he's working against a position he hasn't fully resolved." "You've read it before." "Twice," she said, the second time more carefully. I looked down at my papers. The fire shifted. Outside the windows, the November wind was doing what it did along the northern edge of Ashvere, which was to move with a low, persistent purpose across the fields. "The light is better at this table," I said after a moment. "If you need it." She glanced toward my table, which was larger and set at the angle that caught the candlelight most evenly. "I have enough light," she said. "I'm offering." "I understand," she said, and did not move and return to the Hume. I resumed my papers, but I was listening now to the cadence of the prose when she moved her lips along the better sentences, not intrusively, the sound barely carrying across the room, and the thing that I noticed and that I did not immediately have language for was this: she was not uncomfortable. In a room with a man who had acquired, in the months since March, the habit of making people uncomfortable. She was simply there, reading Hume, deciding the Stuart sections had a better argument and finding her own light adequate. I left the library at 11. I said good night. She said good night. Neither of us added anything to it. The letters from London arrived in batches. Gerald wrote once a week, with news I could have predicted. The season was anticipating my return. Lord and Lady Hartwick had asked after me. The business with the Northern Road Commission was being handled in my absence, but would benefit from my presence. Everyone hoped my health was, and here the phrasing always became delicate, improved. I wrote back with the predictability of a man who has established a pattern and has no intention of disturbing it. The estate accounts, the mill, the timber contracts. I was, on paper, entirely functional. On paper, I was the Duke of Ashvere, who had briefly sustained an injury, and was managing his affairs from the north, while society waited for his convenient return. I burned Gerald's letter about the Hartwick dinner, not in anger, in the specific exhaustion of a man who has spent 9 months imagining a room full of people redirecting their gaze. The Countess called me in for one of our 20-minute visits in the second week of November. She was sitting in her chair by the east window, wrapped in the shawl Miss Vane had clearly arranged for her, and she was looking at me with the particular attention of a woman who has been thinking about something and has decided she may as well say it. "You look worse than last month," she said. "Thank you, Aunt." "I'm not being insulting, Edmund, I'm being observational. You have the look of a man who is subsisting. There's a difference between subsisting and living, and you are currently on the wrong side of it." "I'm managing the estate." "You're hiding in the library." "The library," I said, with the composure of a man who has been told an accurate thing, "is where I work." "You work everywhere. In the library you also sit in the dark after 11 o'clock when the fire is low and you can't read any more." She regarded me calmly. "Mrs. Alderton tells me." Mrs. Alderton, I noted, was a remarkably thorough ledger-keeper. "Your father," the Countess continued, "was the same after your mother died, sealed himself up like a house at the end of summer. It took him 2 years to open the windows again. I never thought you'd take after him in this particular way. You always seemed the more practical of the two." "I am practical." "Then be practical about this." She smoothed the shawl. "The girl is good company, not intrusive. She has the sense not to chatter, but she's there, which is more than I can say for most of the people you've kept around you this year. Don't run her off." I had not been running anyone off. I thought specifically of the evenings in the library, of the Hume and the position on the Stuart sections, of the quality of a silence occupied by 2 people neither of whom required it to be anything other than what it was. "I have no intention of running anyone off," I said. The Countess made the sound she made when she found an answer technically accurate and practically insufficient. It was in the 3rd week of November that I made my first deliberate mistake. I had come to the library early, 5 in the afternoon, the good flat light still holding at the windows, and she was already there at the small table, writing a letter. I took my usual place. We worked in silence for a quarter of an hour. Then she said, not looking up, "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" I said she might. "The walled garden," she said, "on the south side. Mrs. Alderton mentioned it used to have a full winter program, cabbages, leeks, some kind of late apple variety. I saw it from the upper window. It's been left since." She paused for a fraction of a second, choosing a word. "Since last season. I wondered if you intended to revive it. It had been left since March. The garden had been my project, one of several things I had stopped doing in the months after the accident. The head gardener had asked twice. I had deferred twice. The garden had learned, as everything at Ashvere had learned, to manage without me. I hadn't thought about it, I said. The soil will need turning soon if you mean to plant in spring. She looked up now directly. I'm no gardener. I only noticed because the beds are well made. Someone knew what they were doing. It seemed a waste. Someone had known what they were doing. I had known what I was doing. I had designed those beds when I was 22 and restored the old stone walls when I was 25 and planted the apple variety, a northern cultivar called the Ashvere russet, which my grandfather had developed and which existed nowhere else. When I was 28, with the particular satisfaction of a man continuing something that deserved to be continued. I'll speak to Donaldson, I said, the head gardener. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to press. You didn't press, I picked up my pen. You noticed that's different. A silence. Then carefully, is it better in the afternoons, the light I mean? I've noticed you prefer the afternoons. The deliberate mistake, I answered honestly. The left side gives me less trouble in flat light, I said. Angled or low sun is harder. Morning is the most difficult. She received this without adjustment, no lowering of the voice, no careful softening of the expression, just the same quality of attention she had given the question about the garden. Then the library is sensible, she said. The south windows give the flattest afternoon light in the house. I know. I won't use the mornings, she said, if that would help. I looked at her. She was back to her letter, the pen moving in the unhurried way that suggested a person who thought before they wrote rather than while they wrote. You don't have to arrange yourself around my hours, I said. I'm not arranging myself, she said, with a precision that was not unkind. I'm just preferring the afternoons. She continued her letter. I continued my papers. Outside, the November light was doing its slow work toward dark. I told Donaldson to begin turning the south garden beds in the last week of November. He came to me with a list. The russet tree needed pruning. 2 of the stone walls had settled and required resetting. The late-planted leek bed could still be coaxed into something by January if we moved quickly. He stood in the doorway of my study with the quiet wariness of a man who had spent 8 months not asking questions, and now that the door had opened he was careful not to let it close again too quickly. Good, I said to each item on the list. Good. See to the wall first. The settling will undermine the bed if we leave it. Donaldson said yes, Your Grace, and turned to leave and then turned back. The russet, he said. We've got good root stock, strong. We could take cuttings in spring, make it worth the pruning. Do it, I said. He left. I sat for a moment in the study, which had the worst morning light in the house and which I used anyway out of habit, and I thought about cuttings in spring, about the specific pleasure of a thing worth continuing. I could not have told you whether it was the garden or the evenings in the library that had started me thinking in terms of spring. I did not investigate the question. I simply told Donaldson to see to the wall. December brought early cold and the Countess's second bout of winter chest complaint. The physician came from Harwick. The prescription was rest and warmth and no draughts. The east wing became even quieter than usual. Miss Vane managed the Countess with a calm efficiency that Mrs. Alderton reported with the approval she reserved for things done correctly. The evenings in the library continued. We had developed, without ever agreeing to it, a set of understandings. She read at the small table. I worked at the large one. She did not speak unless there was something worth saying. I returned the same courtesy. Occasionally she read aloud. The Hume was finished, and she had moved to a natural history volume that she regarded with a skeptical eye and discussed aloud when a claim struck her as requiring interrogation. generally addressing these remarks to the book itself rather than to me, though I had begun to interject when the book, in my estimation, deserved its skepticism. One evening she said, to the natural history volume, "He's never actually seen one of these birds." "He's working from Bewick," I said without looking up. "The illustrations are good. The field observation is unreliable." "You know Bewick's work." "My father had the complete set. I read it when I was 11 and found the same problem. The aquatic birds are better than the land birds." She turned a page. "The waterfowl descriptions here are actually worse." He's paraphrasing someone who was paraphrasing someone who may or may not have stood near a marsh. She made a sound that was just short of a laugh, not quite. She kept it brief, a compression rather than an expression, but I heard the shape of it. It was the first time since March that I had said something intended to be dry and had it received the way I intended it. I did not remark on this. I noted it in the way you note a change in weather when you have been watching the same sky for a long time. The Countess recovered by the 3rd week of December. She celebrated by requiring a longer reading session and a specific passage from Cowper's letters that she was certain she had told Miss Vane about in October. Miss Vane produced the Cowper letters from the library shelf without comment, which the Countess accepted as proof that the girl had been listening all along. Christmas was quiet at Ashvere, as it had been quiet for 2 years. I sent the appropriate gifts to the tenant families and the appropriate letters to my London acquaintances, and I sat in the library on Christmas evening with a glass of port and a technical treatise on drainage that was not particularly interesting but was at least specific, which I found that year the most manageable quality a text could have. Miss Vane had gone to her sister's for the holiday week. She had mentioned it simply in the library on the 19th. Her sister in Beverly 3 days, the regular coach from Harwick. She would return on the 26th. The library was different without her. I mean this precisely. The room was the same dimensions, the same fire, the same flat afternoon light, the same shelves I could navigate by memory. But there was a quality in its silence when she was there, the scratch of her pen or the particular still attention of her reading, that was distinct from the silence of an empty room, and the empty room made that distinction clear. I was aware on Christmas evening with the port and the drainage treatise that this was a useful piece of information about myself. I did not do anything with it. I read about drainage. I went to bed. She was back on the 26th. I heard the carriage at 4 in the afternoon from the library window, and I was unreasonably precise about the time. January was when everything shifted, though it would take me until February to understand what had shifted. The first thing, Donaldson brought me into the walled garden on a morning when the light was brisk and flat from the north, which was the best kind of winter morning light for my left eye, and showed me the wall repairs and the turned beds and the pruned russet apple with its clean-cut ends. He was quietly proud of the work, as he had reason to be. I walked the beds with him and discussed the spring planting and the positions for the leek beds, and I found, standing in the cold of the garden in January, that I had been thinking about it for weeks without noticing. The arrangement of the beds, the sequence, the specific pleasure of getting it right. "The russet cutting stock," I said. "You've got it protected." "In the cold frame, Your Grace, 6 good cuttings." "Good." I stood at the pruned tree for a moment. It was an old tree now, not my grandfather's original, which had been taken by a storm in my father's time, but the one we had grown from the original stock, which made it a continuation rather than a replacement. I had not thought of this distinction in months. The second thing, Gerald's January letter arrived with a postscript from an acquaintance, a Lord Fenwick, who had heard through various channels that I was considering a return to London for the spring season and wanted to confirm the rumor. I had not confirmed any such rumor. I had not, in fact, thought about London. But I read the postscript twice, and I did not burn it. The third thing happened in the library on the 12th of January. Miss Vane had a new book, a volume of correspondence between two naturalists, published the previous decade, that she had found in the upper shelves, and she was reading it with the focused pleasure of someone who has found exactly what they wanted. I was working on the spring tenancy accounts. The fire was built higher than usual, because the temperature had dropped sharply the previous night. She said without preamble, "Do you miss London?" I set down my pen. "What? London, do you miss it?" She did not look up from the correspondence. "I'm not asking to press, I'm curious." "Why curious?" "You seem to be a man who prefers engagement," she said. "The accounts, the garden, the conversations." She paused. "The Bewick, you have opinions. People with opinions tend to require a larger audience than an elderly countess and a companion, eventually." This was the longest sustained observation she had made about me, and it was delivered in the same tone she used to disagree with the natural history volume, direct, without malice, a statement of what she had observed. "I have opinions about Bewick," I said. "That's not a transferable quality." "No," she agreed, "but the thinking behind it is." I considered this. "I haven't missed London," I said. "I've missed not being required to calculate the room before I walk into it. That isn't London specifically. That's any room with more than a handful of people." She looked up now. Her attention was the same as it always was, a clean, unreserved regard, the kind that neither softens what it sees nor editorializes. "You calculate the light," she said. "Yes." "And where people are." "Yes." "That's not the same as not wanting to be there." She returned to the correspondence. "It's an extra step, an inconvenient one, but it's a step, not a wall." I looked at her. She was reading. "When did you become so categorical?" I asked. "I was always categorical," she said. "I was simply quiet about it." I walked in the walled garden on the morning of the 15th. It was cold and the ground was hard under the frost, and the light was the good flat northern light that I could use cleanly, and I walked the beds 3 times while thinking about a conversation in a library, which is perhaps not the most efficient use of a morning's ambulation, but which seemed to be what the morning required of me. I thought about the word she had used. Step, not wall. The particular precision of it. She had not said "it won't be so bad" or "I'm sure you'll manage" or any of the phrases that people had been handing me since March with the careful packaging of good intentions. She had simply said, "extra step, not a wall," a factual distinction. I thought about the year since March. I had moved through it, I saw now, with the methodology of a man keeping himself very busy in a small space. The accounts, the library, the estate, all real work, all genuinely necessary, and all contained within a perimeter I had not crossed. Not because crossing it was impossible, because I had been waiting, in the particular way of a man who does not admit to himself that he is waiting, for the room on the other side to feel manageable. The russet apple stood at the end of the garden's south walk. I stood in front of it for a while, looking at the cut ends Donaldson had made clean, correct, the cuts that would give the spring growth something proper to build on. Cutting back, my grandfather had always said, is not the same as giving up. It's making room for the next thing. February was when I acknowledged it. Not to her, not yet, not in words, but I acknowledged it to myself in the specific, unadorned way a man of practical temperament eventually has to acknowledge the things he has been circling. I was in love with Cecily Vane. I am aware that saying it plainly like this in retrospect makes it sound as though it arrived suddenly. It did not. It had been accumulating since November with the same unhurried persistence as the library evenings, the Hume argument, the space she left for silence, the step not a wall. I had not named it because I was a man who had spent 9 months learning to be very careful with things that were important to him, and naming something important was a way of exposing it to the light where it could be seen to be what it was. She was not, by any conventional measure, what society would have selected for the Duke of Ashvere, a solicitor's daughter, a companion to an elderly countess. No fortune, no connection, no family name that London would recognize. She was composed and direct and occupied a room without requiring it to reshape itself around her. And she had 2 or 3 opinions about everything worth having opinions about, and she delivered them without apology. And she had looked at me, from the very first morning in the corridor, without performing the calculation everyone else performed. This last thing was what I kept returning to. She had looked at me and seen a man, not an injury, not an inconvenient situation to be managed, not a duty. Just a man, in a corridor, carrying the ordinary inconveniences of a life that had taken a difficult turn, and was now being navigated with the tools available. I sat in the library in February, and I thought about this for several evenings before I thought about what to do about it. What I decided to do about it was nothing, for 3 more weeks. This is not cowardice. I am explaining it precisely. I had spent 9 months becoming a man who moved carefully, who did not trust the first impulse or the loudest feeling, who waited until he was certain before he committed. These were not bad habits. They were the habits that had kept Ashvere stable and the estate functioning and the Countess comfortable and the staff employed during a year that had, in other configurations, broken other men I knew of. But there was a night in February, the 21st. I know because I checked the Countess's ledger later, when I came into the library and found her standing at the east window looking out at the snow that had been falling since afternoon. She did not hear me come in. She was quite still, her back to the room, the candle on the table making a low gold on the window glass and the snow beyond it blue-white and continuous. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I had not seen her when she didn't know I was watching. It was different. She was different. The careful composition she carried in occupied rooms slightly loosened, the private quality of a person alone with their own thoughts. Whatever she was thinking about, looking at the snow, was entirely hers. I should have coughed, or stepped, or announced myself. Instead, I stood there for perhaps 5 seconds longer than I should have, and then I stepped and she turned and found me in the doorway. "Your Grace," she said, with the composure of a person who has learned to compose herself quickly. Not embarrassed, she was not easily embarrassed, but aware of the 5 seconds, I thought. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't want to startle you." "You didn't." She turned back to the window briefly, then to the room. "The snow is very clean from this window. You can see the walled garden from here. The beds are covered now." "I know. The russet apple looks like a drawing," she said. "The bare branches with the snow on them." I came into the room. I did not go to my usual table. I stood at the window beside her and we looked at the snow together, the garden below in its white February stillness, the apple at the far end of the south walk, the beds Donaldson had turned, waiting. We stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. Neither of us spoke. The snow continued. "Miss Vane," I said. "Yes." "I find that I have been thinking for some months about the spring." A pause. "The garden," she said carefully. "The garden," I agreed, "and other things." The snow went on falling. The library was warm at our backs. "I won't say it awkwardly," I said, which was a lie because I was already saying it awkwardly, and she was clearly aware of this, and she was waiting with the patience she applied to everything, the Countess, the Hume, the natural history volume, giving the thing in front of her the space to arrive. "I mean to go to London in the spring," I said, "not because Gerald has asked me to, not because Fenwick has heard a rumor. Because I have been here long enough, and there are things worth going back for." "That seems right," she said quietly, "if it's what you want." "I don't know yet what I want," I said, which was also a lie and a less convincing one. "I am working toward knowing." She looked at me then. The same direct, clear look she had given me the first morning in the corridor, unreserved, unmanaged, the simple attention of a person who is just looking at what is there. "Take your time," she said. And then she went to her table and opened her book, and I went to my table and sat down and picked up my pen, and the snow continued outside the window, and the library held us the way it had held us since November. Quietly, without requirement, with the fire keeping the right temperature and the light on the window, and the silence that was not empty because we were both in it. I went to London in April. Not the whole season, 10 days. Gerald was visibly relieved and managed not to say so too many times. I attended 3 engagements. I walked into 3 rooms full of people and did what Miss Vane had said. I took the extra step. I calculated the light before I entered. I placed myself where the angle was manageable. I had conversations. It was hard in a way I had expected and manageable in a way I had not. The managing part was this. I had spent the winter not retreating from difficulty, but renegotiating my relationship to it. In the library, at the eastern table, with the flat afternoon light and the drafts of the drainage accounts and the occasional observation from a woman who read Hume twice and found the Stuart sections better argued, I had relearned how to occupy a space without apologizing for it. This was, I understood in London, a transferable quality. I came back to Ashvere on the 14th of April. The drive from Harwich took 2 hours in good spring light, and when the carriage came through the Ashvere gates, and the house came up ahead with its stone face and its windows catching the late afternoon, I felt, with an uncomplicated clarity I had not expected, that I was coming home. Not to a house, to a life, to the specific weight of a place you have chosen after a year of not fully choosing anything. The walled garden on the morning of the 15th. I had been back less than 12 hours. I had slept a full night for the first time in 10 days, in my own bed with the northern window cracked the way I preferred it, and I was in the garden by 8 with the April light coming in clean, and even from the east, and the beds showing the first serious green of the spring planting. Leek rose, the early cabbage, the beds of kitchen herbs Donaldson had gotten in under the cold frame weeks ahead of when they were needed. The russet apple was in the first flush of its spring growth. The cut ends from January had healed clean and put out the new growth that cut ends are supposed to put out when the pruning has been done correctly. The 6 cuttings in the cold frame had taken, Donaldson had shown me the roots, compact and decisive. I was standing at the apple tree when I heard the garden gate. She came through it with the purposeful quiet that was her ordinary mode. She had a basket, because it was the morning she collected the herbs for the Countess's tea, a task she had taken on somewhere in the winter and which had given her a reason to be in the garden at this hour. She did not see me at first. She went to the herb bed at the near end of the walk and crouched down with the basket and began her work. I stood at the apple tree and looked at her. She straightened, turned, and saw me. She did not startle. She held the basket. "You're back," she said. "Last night. How was it?" "Harder than I wanted it to be," I said. "More manageable than I expected." She considered this. "That seems about right." "Yes," I said. I walked from the apple tree toward her. Not quickly. The April ground was still soft in patches, and the left side was doing its particular unreliable work in the angled morning light, and I went at the pace that the circumstances required. When I reached her, I was standing 3 feet from her, and I could see her face clearly in the even light, which was the best I could ask of April. "I told you in February that I was working toward knowing what I wanted," I said. "You did." "I've been working toward it since February," I said. "I've arrived." She looked at me with the look she had always given me, clear, unreserved, no adjustment, and she waited. "I want you to stay," I said, "not as the Countess's companion or not only as that. I want you to stay at Ashvere because I am, because the library is different when you're in it, because the garden is worth reviving, because I have been in the dark for a year and I didn't know I was in it until you were there and the room changed quality." I stopped. That is a great deal to say to someone in a garden. I'm aware it is. It is, she said, but she was not looking away. I'm not asking you for a London season, I said. I'm not asking you for an introduction to 100 drawing rooms. I'm asking if you're willing for the library, and the garden, and whatever comes next, at whatever speed it comes, without either of us performing anything we don't mean. A silence. The April morning was mild, and the russet apple was putting out its new growth, and somewhere beyond the garden wall Donaldson was going about the work of the morning, with the purposeful quiet of a man who expects things to grow. Cecily Vane looked at me. She said, I've been willing since November. We were married on a Tuesday in September, at the Harwick Church, which was small and not fashionable and exactly the right size. The Countess attended in a chair her physician had specified, and her dignity had improved upon, and she told Mrs. Alderton afterward that it was the most sensible wedding she had witnessed in 50 years, because it had not attempted to be anything other than what it was. Gerald brought his wife. Donaldson brought the first of the russet apple cuttings, now rooted and planted in a pot, which he presented to us as we left the church with the seriousness of a man who understands that a living thing is the right gift for the beginning of a life. We went back to Ashvere. Not to London, not then. That came later, and more easily than I had expected, with Cecily beside me in rooms where I had once calculated the light alone and now simply entered. We went back to the house on the Tuesday evening with the September light going long and gold across the fields, and we walked through the south gate into the walled garden in the last of it, and the russet apple stood at the end of the south walk with the late season on it, and the cuttings in their prepared beds along the wall, which Donaldson had arranged with the understanding that the best of a thing is worth making more of. She stood beside me in the September garden and she said, "It's a good tree." "My grandfather grew the first one," I said, "the original." "I know," she said, "you've told me." I had told her. I had told her everything, over the winter evenings and the spring and the slow summer that followed, in the way a man tells things to a person he has decided to be honest with, not all at once, and not with performance, but incrementally, as the occasions arose and the silence between them became the kind of silence you can put things into. She knew about the accident, about the months after, about the room I had boarded up with the chair against the door, about March and the long winter and the way the library had been mine, and then hours without either of us agreeing to it. She knew about the year I had spent learning to live in a smaller space, and the year after that of learning, one step at a time, to take the space back. She put her hand in mine in the September garden, not reaching for it, just placing it there, as if it were the obvious thing to do, which it was. "Ready to go in," she said. I looked at the garden, at the beds, at the apple, at the long evening light doing its work across the stone walls, at the whole thing exactly as it was. "Yes," I said. And we went in.